Nothing you will ever write is truly original. I say that as one of the most liberating truths a writer can internalize. Every story ever told draws from stories that came before it. Every voice that feels distinctive was shaped by the voices its owner spent years reading. Every idea that feels fresh is a combination of older ideas, filtered through a particular sensibility, expressed in a particular moment. It is far from being plagiarism. Rather, this is how literature works. It has always worked this way, from ancient Greeks borrowing their myths, to Shakespeare reworking Italian novellas, to even contemporary novelists who has been shaped by a book they read at the right moment in their life. The question then is not whether you will be influenced, since you will be influenced. Instead, the question is whether you will be influenced deliberately or by default. And that question is what a personal library is all about. My name is Ahmed Al-Dwage. I've spent the last decade writing 15 novels across multiple pen names. I founded Aushki Press as well as EndNote Books, a curated bookshop for those who want to read between the hype, and I welcome you back to the Deliberate Pen podcast. First, I want to be honest here for a second. For the first couple of years of my writing life, I didn't read fiction at all. Now, I suspect I'm not alone in this, and yet back then I couldn't figure out what I was missing up on. Mind you, it wasn't because I couldn't, nor because I didn't have access to quality fiction. Rather, I had sort of convinced myself it wasn't useful, since after all, I was a writer, I write books. Why would I spend time reading someone else's story when I could be crafting my own? There was a second reason, one I was less willing to admit at the time. I was afraid of being influenced, afraid that if I read too deeply into someone else's work, their voice would bleed into mine, their plot structure would unconsciously shape my own, that I would end up writing something that was less mine and more theirs. Indeed, it was a genuine concern of mine, and so I kept my distance from fiction. I do read nonfiction, history, psychology, philosophy, the type of books that allegedly did not contaminate my creativity while also offering me invaluable knowledge about the truths of life. Now, what I didn't understand then, and only began to understand slowly over the years, was that the fear of influence is actually the fear of learning. Every writer you admire was shaped by writers they admired. The influence didn't exactly erase their voice, instead, it built it. That is, the writers who have read nothing sound like nothing. Meanwhile, the writers who have read deeply sound like themselves, because they have absorbed enough to synthesize, to push back, to find the gap between what has been done and what they want to do. This is how humanity has functioned for thousands of years in regards to their storytelling. Of course, the shift for me wasn't dramatic, it was gradual. One novel that surprised me, then another, then a realization that fiction had impact on my writing, and it had impacted my writing in a way that no craft book could ever replicate. It was showing me, at the level of felt experience, what story actually does to a reader. And once I understood that from the inside, I couldn't unlearn it. I was the reader of fiction for a change. I could see and feel what the reader would upon flipping through the pages and getting immersed in a story. Thus, I emerged with the verdicts regarding writing. It did not dilute my writing and style, and if anything, it deepened and optimized it. Let me state this plainly. Reading is not separate from writing. It is not the leisure activity that you return to when the writing is done. It is the raw material the writing draws from, continuously and over years. Every book you read with attention becomes part of your instinct. You absorb rhythms of prose without consciously studying them. You internalize structures of a story without mapping them on a whiteboard. You develop a sense of what a scene needs, what a character is missing, what a paragraph is doing wrong, because you have read enough to feel the difference. And this is not something you can shortcut. You cannot watch enough YouTube videos about writing craft to replace the experience of reading deeply. You cannot attend enough workshops to substitute for years of accumulated reading that trains a writer's ear. Reading as a writer is fundamentally different than reading as a reader. The reader asks, what happens next? The writer asks, how is this being done? It's that second question that separates reading that compounds into craft from reading that simply passes the time. You don't need to read with a highlighter in hand or a notebook open beside you, but you do need a part of your attention running beneath the story, noticing the decisions the author is making. Notice how a chapter opens. Does it begin mid-sentence or with establishing context? What choice and what does that choice signal about the author's relationship with the reader's patience? Notice how dialogue is handled, what gets said directly, what gets deflected, what is communicated through what a character refuses to say. Notice where tension lives. Is it in the plot or in the prose itself? in a sentence that would withhold its meaning until the last word. Notice, above all, what the author does when nothing is happening. Those quiet scenes, the transitions, the moments between events. These are the spots where writers prove their skill, since there is no plot to carry them. Suffice to say, you don't need to analyze every book this way. Some books you read purely for pleasure, and that has its own value. But at least once a week, once a chapter, ask that second question. Over years, those answers accumulate into instinct, and instinct is what separates the writer who knows the rules from the writer who knows when to break said rules. Writing is a craft, and just like any other craft, you need hands-on experience, on the receiving end of the book, mind you. It is one thing to practice writing to get better at writing, but being a better fiction writer in particular demands exposure to composed works, just how learning Japanese requires one to consume works in Japanese in order to acquire that element of familiarity. Thus, the deliberate writer reads consistently, intentionally, and as a crucial part of the practice. With that being said, do keep in mind that how one reads and what one keeps matters more than what most writers acknowledge. And within that argument of physical versus digital books, I am here to make the case of physical books. Far from being a nostalgic or aesthetic option, I want to make the argument for the serious and deliberate writer. The first argument is annotation. A physical book you engage with becomes a conversation. Your annotations, those underlines, asterisks, the notes in the margins, the highly controversial dog-eared pages, all of which turns a book into a document of your thinking at the point in time you first read it. Thus, when you return to that book years later, you would not be just rereading the author's work, rather, you're essentially reading yourself in a dialogue with the author. This layering of thought is something no ebook replaces, at least not 100%. I get that today's ebooks readers allow for highlighting and you can even add notes that pop up whenever you tap them. Then again, ask any deliberate reader who has tried both, chances are the majority would lean for the feel of a paper in their hands. The second argument has to do with retention. There's growing evidence that we read differently on screens, faster, more skimming, and less deep processing. Now, for casual reading, that may be acceptable. However, for a writer reading to learn, it really isn't. The physical book slows you down in a way that serves comprehension. The third argument is ownership, and this one has become increasingly concrete and hard to naively ignore. When you buy an ebook, you are not buying a book, you are buying a license to access a book. A license that can be revoked. Amazon, for example, has demonstrated this more than once, most recently with the moves that have raised serious questions about long-term ebook ownership, be it changing a book cover unannounced or, worse, removing the book from your device without any prior notice. The books in your digital library exist at the discretion of a corporation. The books in your shelf exist at your discretion and will likely outlive you. Now, when we talk about a writer building a library that meant to last decades, and meant to be returned to, annotated, lent to no one, kept permanently, physical books are not a preference anymore. They are the only serious option. Don't get me wrong, ebooks have their place, traveling or for convenience, out-of-print titles, but they are a reading tool. The library is physical, it's there. Moreover, there is one reading practice that separates the serious writer's library from everyone else's, and it's simply the idea of rereading a book. Most readers finish a book and move on, whereas the deliberate writer returns back to it. Here's why this matters practically. The first time you read a book, you are in the grip of the story. You're asking what happens next, turning pages, carried forward by momentum. You're experiencing the book as a reader, which is necessary. You need to feel what it does before you can understand how it does it. However, the second time you read the same book, you already know what happens. The suspense is gone, and in its place is something far more useful as a writer. You can finally see the machinery, the foreshadowing you initially missed, the structural choices that felt invisible on the first read because they were working exactly as intended, the sentence that seemed effortless and on second reading reveals itself as one of the most carefully constructed things you have ever encountered. This is precisely why the physical library matters beyond sentiment. You cannot reread a book you don't own. You cannot return to a book you borrowed, passed on, or stored in a cloud library that may or may not exist in 5 years. The books on your shelf are the books you intend to read twice. That is the standard. If you finish a book and feel no need to return to it, it was worth reading, perhaps, but it has not earned its place on the shelf. Build your library from books worth returning to, and then return to them. This brings us to the notion of building a personal library. You see, a personal library should, by definition, be a collection of books worth returning to, not just a bunch of books you bought years ago and haven't yet gotten to read. This distinction matters a lot, since the majority of readers accumulate hoarding hundreds of books. Meanwhile, the deliberate writer creates with intention. A question worth asking is, what earns a place on the shelf? Well, a book that changed how you view books or how you think. A book that taught you something about craft at a level you haven't fully observed yet. A book whose sentences you want to study. A reference you will reach for again and again. A work that represents a standard you're trying to meet. Those are the books that one should seek after and keep by his side. Now, on the other hand, which book doesn't earn a place? A book you finished and felt nothing. A book you read for the plot and found no craft worth studying. A book that was fine, competent, forgettable, disposable. Mind you, the writer's library should be smaller than you think and denser than most bookshelves you've seen. 50 books that matter deeply are more worth than 500 books that sit unread and unremembered. You need to build it slowly. You need to purchase these books with intention. And if you are looking for a starting point, a place to find books chosen for the serious reader rather than the casual market, that is precisely what EndNote Books was built for. A curated bookshop designed on the premise that what you read shapes what you write. If you're interested, you can access the website by clicking on the link below or just type endnotebooks.com. Having elaborated on building a writer's personal library, allow me to close with 3 specific recommendations that work together to cover the craft as 3 distinct levels. First, The Elements of Style by Strunk and White. This is the sentence level, 85 pages that have shaped more writers than almost any other book in the English language. It is not a book you read once, rather, it's one that you return to every few years and find something new each time. If your prose has a problem, the answer is probably somewhere in here. Own it, read it slowly, and keep it close by. The next book is Save the Cat Writes a Novel by Jessica Brody. This is the structure level. Blake Snyder's original Save the Cat was written for screenwriters, and Brody's adaptation brings that beat sheet framework into fiction with clarity and practicality. Suffice to say, it won't write the novel for you, since no book can, but it will give you the structure vocabulary that makes the architecture of story visible, particularly useful when a manuscript stalls and you can't diagnose why. In fact, this was one of the first books I read fully back in 2020. At that time, I was at a point where my writing got stalled and I didn't really know where to go. My plots felt basic and all over the place. I genuinely thought I had unique plots that did not fit any genres. Yet, Save the Cat's 10 main genres eventually paved the way for me. Lastly, we have a classic that survived thousands of years, Aristotle's Poetics. This is the philosophy level, the last of the 3. Written in the 4th century BC, it remains the most foundational text on the nature of story ever produced. Plot, characters, unity of action. Aristotle identified the essential elements of narrative so precisely that even nowadays, story theory is still, in many ways, a footnote to his work. It is short, dense, and worth reading slowly. If you do seek it out, I recommend you examine different translations and find one that suits you. The translation matters a lot with Aristotle. These 3 books cover the sentence, the structure, and the philosophy of story. If your shelf holds nothing else, it holds something worth writing from. Your library is a reflection of your literary ambition. A shelf with books chosen carelessly tells you something about how seriously you take the craft. A shelf full of books chosen deliberately, annotated, returned to, earn their place, tells you something else entirely. Build it like you mean it. Build it for the writing it will feed over the next decade or so. Don't fall into the illusion of a dense, wide library that makes for an impressive picture. Those often get donated first thing after one sets path off this lifetime into the next. Next episode will be the season finale for the Deliberate Pens per season. After 15 books, a publishing house, and a bookshop, what has the writing actually taught me? What a decade at the desk and on the go does to a person? And what does it give back? Remember, writing is a blessing. Don't make it testify against you. This is the Deliberate Pen Podcast. I'll see you in the next episode.